They said the boy never flinched, 9 years old, standing barefoot in the red dust, the sun hitting his pale hair like flame. 27 men tied to the post, the air thick with sweat, flies, and the smell of leather. And through it all, he just watched, not because he was brave, but because his father told him this was what a man did. He looked at what others turned away from. His name was Thomas Reed, Jr., the overseer's son on the Blythewood plantation in Alabama, 1854. And by the time he was 10, he had already learned that pain was something you could teach, like reading, or scripture, or love. Before we tell you how that lesson ended, make sure you subscribe to the Macabre Record. We tell the stories history refused to speak aloud, tales of the broken, the silenced, and the moments when humanity turned its face away. Now, let's go back to Blythewood, to the boy who thought cruelty was kindness. The Alabama sun had a way of making everything look holy, even cruelty. It baked the earth until it cracked, burned the skin until it bled, and bleached every color from the land except red. The field was still that morning, except for the sound of rope tightening and men breathing through pain. Thomas Reed, Jr. stood beside his father, the overseer, with his small hands clasped behind his back, the way his father did. He was only 9, but he'd already learned how to stand like a man, straight spine, blank face, eyes forward. That was the first rule. Never look away. 27 today, his father said, voice steady as if counting bales of cotton. Lazy season makes lazy hands. He spat into the dirt and wiped the sweat from his brow. Behind him, the sun climbed higher, sharpening every shadow into a blade. The first man tied to the post didn't beg. He only looked at the boy, not at the whip. And for a moment, Thomas Jr. thought he saw something behind the man's stare. Not hate, not fear. Something quieter. Pity, maybe. When the first crack split the air, the boy's chest jumped, but he didn't blink. His father turned and smiled faintly. That's my son. A reed don't flinch. The sound went on, the whip cutting through morning like lightning without rain. The men's cries rose and fell, the overseer's rhythm never breaking. The smell of sweat, dust, and iron filled the boy's nose until he thought he'd choke on it. But he didn't. He kept his father's posture, his face cold, his breathing slow. He wasn't proud. He wasn't afraid. He was learning. When it ended, the men were dragged away like sacks of wet grain. The father tossed the whip into a bucket and lit his pipe. You watch long enough, Tommy, you start to see it proper. Discipline's a kindness. Men forget their place. You remind them. That's love. In the world we got. Thomas looked down at the ground. A drop of blood had landed on his boot. Just one. He didn't wipe it off. He stared at it as the dust began to rise again, swallowing everything but that red mark on brown leather. It was the first thing he'd ever been given that felt like his own. As they walked back toward the house, his father's hand rested heavy on his shoulder. You did good, boy, he said. Didn't turn away once. Thomas Jr. nodded. No, sir. And in the boy's mind, something settled quietly, the seed of a lesson he didn't yet understand, that to please his father he had to stop feeling what made him human. For the next week, the plantation moved slower, quieter. The men in the fields didn't speak above whispers, and even the overseer's hound seemed to bark less. The air itself carried the memory of that morning, the sound of rope, the smell of sweat baked into the earth. But the boy didn't notice. Thomas Jr. followed his father everywhere now, to the storehouse, to the fields, to the sugar sheds. He stood beside him when men were scolded, when orders were shouted, when someone was punished for something small and ordinary, like stopping to drink or wiping sweat with the wrong hand. He was never told to watch. He just did. At night, when his mother asked, "What did you learn today, Tommy?" he'd answer, "How to make men listen." She'd stop stirring the pot and look at him for a long time, her lips trembling with words she didn't dare say. Then she'd nod, pretending it was a fine thing to learn. The field hands had started calling him Little Overseer, never to his face, never loud, but he heard it once through an open window, and he didn't know if it was meant as mockery or respect. One morning, while his father barked orders, Thomas Jr. noticed a man in the far row pause for half a breath too long. "Pa," he said quietly, pointing. "That one's slowing." His father looked over, then back at him, and smiled. "You got an eye for it," he said, clapping him on the back. "Keep it sharp." That evening, the man was whipped. The boy watched again, his face blank, the dust curling around his boots. He didn't blink this time either. At night, lying in bed, he tried to remember what the man's voice sounded like before he screamed. He couldn't. The noise in his head had drowned it out. But one thing stayed with him, the way his father had looked at him afterward, pride shining like sunlight on glass. No one had ever looked at him that way before. When he closed his eyes, he saw the whip flash white, heard the snap again. He thought of his father's words. "Discipline's a kindness." He repeated them softly, like a prayer. He didn't understand what they meant, but they felt right when he said them out loud. Down in the quarters, Aunt Clara told the others, "That child's eyes don't move." Like he's memorizing pain, no one answered her. They all knew better than to speak the overseer's son's name in the dark. But when they prayed that night, they didn't pray for the men who'd been whipped. They prayed for the boy who didn't blink. Ellen Reed had stopped asking her son what he learned each day. She already knew. She could see it in his face. That stillness that didn't belong to a child. The lines around his mouth were too tight, the eyes too still. He watched everything the way his father did, like he was waiting for something to break. The women in town said she was lucky. A house, good clothes, a husband with steady work. They didn't see what she saw, how the blood never washed clean from his boots, how her son's drawings had changed. Thomas Jr. used to draw animals, cows, dogs, sometimes the birds perched on the fence. But lately he'd started filling the barn wall with faces, dozens of them, men's faces, some frowning, some wide-eyed, some just blank. All drawn with a bit of chalk he stole from the schoolhouse, all of them marked with lines across their backs, faint strokes, like he was counting something. Ellen found him there one afternoon, standing barefoot in the dust, tracing a finger over one of the faces. "Who are they, Tommy?" she asked softly. He shrugged. "Just people." "Do you know them?" He looked at her for the first time that day. "Pa says it's good to remember who listens." Her stomach twisted. She wanted to scold him, to grab the chalk and wash every face away. But his tone wasn't cruel. It was calm, practiced, like he was reciting something. She only managed a whisper. "They're not yours to remember, son." He didn't answer. "That night," she told her husband. Thomas Sr. laughed, wiping his hands on his shirt. "Boy's got a memory." "Better that than running wild. He's a child," she said. "He's got no place watching men bleed." He leaned back, pipe smoke curling around his grin. "That's how I learned." "You want him soft. You want him worthless." Ellen looked at the fire, her voice almost breaking. "I just want him kind." Her husband's smile faded. "Kind don't build a house, Ellen. Kind gets you killed." He left her there, the air heavy with smoke and silence. Later, when she went to check on her son, she found him asleep, his hand curled around the piece of chalk. His lips moved faintly, whispering something she couldn't hear. She leaned close and caught the words, "Didn't turn away." She covered his hand with hers, gently prying the chalk loose. But even in sleep, his fingers wouldn't let go. The field was still, except for the sound of flies. Summer had already come, thick and heavy, the kind of heat that made the world feel slow. The whipping post stood at the center of the yard, casting a short, hard shadow. The blood from last week's punishment had dried into a dark stain at its base, and dust clung to it like second skin. Thomas Jr. wandered there alone that morning, dragging a stick through the dirt. He wasn't supposed to be out that early, but he liked the quiet before the workday began, the moment before men came to bend and sweat and break. He stopped at the post. It looked smaller now, ordinary almost, stripped of its noise. The rope was still looped over the beam, the ends frayed and stiff. When he reached up and touched it, he felt a warmth that startled him. Not from the sun, but something else. Something he couldn't name. He pulled the rope down, turning it in his hands. The smell rose, sweat and salt and leather. He didn't recoil. He only pressed it between his fingers until the fibers left red impressions in his skin. Then he crouched and dug into the dry dirt beside the post with his stick. The ground was packed hard, so he used both hands, scraping until his nails filled with dust. When the hole was deep enough, he dropped the rope in and covered it back up. "There," he whispered, patting it flat. "You can rest now." It wasn't a prayer, not really, just something he said to the silence. From the porch, Ellen watched him, her hands gripping her apron. She couldn't call out. Something in her throat refused to move. The boy stood and brushed his palms clean, his small shoulders square, like he'd done something sacred. When he came in for breakfast, she asked, "What were you doing out there, Tommy?" He looked at her plainly. "Fixing what Pa broke." She froze. "What do you mean?" He shrugged. "The rope was tired. I buried it." He said it with no guilt, no sadness, just a matter-of-fact tone, like it was his duty. She wanted to hold him, shake him, make him understand that the world he was learning was not the one he was meant to carry. But he was already slipping beyond her reach. That evening, she found him back near the post, staring at the patch of disturbed soil. The boy's expression wasn't cold. It was tender, almost reverent. To him, the field was no longer a place of pain. It was where he'd learned that control could feel like care. That night, the dining room was quiet, except for the sound of knives scraping against tin plates. The lantern light flickered on the wooden table, turning sweat into a soft shine on the men's foreheads. The house always smelled of tobacco and boiled greens, but under it was another scent that Ellen Reed couldn't ignore anymore, the metallic tang that came from her husband's clothes after a long day. Thomas Sr. sat at the head of the table, pipe resting beside his plate, boots still caked with field dust. He'd never bothered to wash before supper. He said it was a working man's badge. Thomas Jr. sat 2 seats down, shoulders straight, mimicking every move his father made. When the older man took a bite, the boy took one. When he reached for the pipe, the boy's hand twitched as if reaching for something too. Ellen's fork barely moved. She watched them both in the flickering light and thought how the boy's face was starting to harden like his father's, the same jawline, the same quiet set to his mouth. "Busy day?" she asked. Her husband didn't look up. Had to make an example of a few. The boy's eyes lifted, curious. "How many, Pa?" "2 this morning, 3 after sundown." He took a long pull from the pipe, smoke drifting through the lamplight. "Hot day. Heat makes men slow. Slow men make trouble." Thomas Jr. chewed slowly, then asked, "Did they thank you after?" The room went still. Ellen's breath caught, but the father only smirked. "Not out loud," he said, tapping his pipe on the table. "But they know. Deep down, they do. You keep a man alive by reminding him who he is. That's what mercy looks like." The boy nodded, eyes wide with something like awe. "Yes, sir." Ellen put her fork down. "Mercy isn't supposed to bleed, Thomas." Her husband turned his head sharply, not toward her, but toward the boy. "You hear your mother?" "That's a woman's way of seeing things. You remember what I tell you? A man shows love by keeping the world in order." The boy repeated it softly, like reciting scripture. "A man shows love by keeping the world in order." His father smiled. "That's right." Ellen looked at her son, his calm, steady expression, and realized he wasn't memorizing words. He was memorizing tone. After supper, when her husband fell asleep in his chair, she found the boy standing in the hallway, staring at his reflection in the glass cabinet. "Go to bed, Tommy," she whispered. He didn't move. "Pa said kindness looks like control." She touched his shoulder, but he didn't flinch. He was still watching himself, as though trying to see what kind of man he was becoming. The rain had come that morning, turning the pasture to soft mud. The world smelled of wet hay and animal breath. Thomas Jr. was out by the pen, his boots sinking in the muck, watching a calf struggle to stand. Its leg was twisted wrong, bent inward like a broken stick. It tried again and again, whining, trembling, until it fell in the mud with a soft, helpless cry. He crouched beside it, studying the way it shook. The leg wasn't just broken, the bone had split through the skin. He'd seen men's legs look like that before. His father's voice echoed in his head. When something's too weak to stand, you put it down. That's mercy. He whispered the words to himself, as if repeating a lesson. He found his father's old knife by the fence post. The blade was dull, but it would do. The calf's eyes rolled white when he touched its neck. It tried to move away, but the leg caught, and it fell again. The boy placed his hand gently on its head. "It's all right," he said softly. "You don't have to hurt no more." He pressed the knife down. It wasn't clean, wasn't quick. He didn't know how to be cruel efficiently yet. When it was done, he sat in the mud beside the body, hands trembling not from horror, but from the weight of responsibility. He thought he'd done something good. By the time his mother found him, his shirt was smeared with blood and rainwater. "Tommy!" she screamed, running across the field. He looked up, blinking against the drizzle. "It couldn't walk," he said. "I helped it stop hurting." She froze, staring at the knife, the still calf, the calm on her son's face. Her voice cracked. "Who told you to do that?" "Pa said mercy's a kind of strength," he answered, almost proudly. "So I was strong." Ellen fell to her knees, pulling him into her arms, but he stood stiff and unresponsive. Not cold, just detached. His small voice sounded almost confused when he said, "Ain't that what he meant?" She couldn't answer. Later, when Thomas Sr. came home, she told him what their son had done. The overseer only nodded. Boys learning the right kind of heart. "This world don't need gentle men that night," Ellen heard her son in his room whispering again, words she couldn't quite catch. When she peeked through the doorway, he was sitting on the floor beside the small wooden cross he'd made from 2 twigs, murmuring softly, "It's better now. It don't hurt no more." She shut the door quietly and pressed her hand to her mouth, afraid to cry loud enough for him to hear. By late summer, the nights at Blythewood carried a strange stillness. The sound of crickets seemed quieter, and the laughter that sometimes drifted from the slave quarters after dark had gone silent. The field hands still worked, still sang in rhythm when overseers passed by, but there was something changed beneath it, something that trembled like fear pretending to be obedience. The whispers started about the same time the boy began following his father everywhere. They said the overseer's son didn't just watch, he memorized, that he could repeat what a man said before the whip fell, that when he stood at the edge of the field, even the birds went quiet. No one dared say his name out loud, but among the quarters they called him Crow-Eye, because he watched like one, still black-pupilled, waiting. Aunt Clara, who'd lived through 3 masters and outlived most of her own children, was the only one who didn't spit the nickname out like a curse. "That boy ain't wicked," she told the others one night, her voice a tired whisper. "He's empty. He don't know what's getting poured in him yet." The others didn't answer. You didn't speak pity for the overseer's child, not where walls had ears. Thomas Jr. didn't know about the whispers, but he felt the stares. When he passed through the yard, people stepped aside, not because of fear exactly, but because no one knew what he understood. He was a child of the house, but carried the silence of the field. And in the strange way that only children notice, he could sense something had shifted, how men stopped humming when he approached, how women pulled their children closer. One afternoon, he found Aunt Clara sweeping the steps outside the smokehouse. She stopped when she saw him, her eyes deep and heavy. "You got no business watching what you seen," she said softly. "Your eyes too young to carry that kind of hurt." The boy tilted his head. "Pa says a man's eyes gotta learn to look." Her mouth twitched, half a grimace, half a smile. "Ain't no man yet, child, and looking ain't the same as seeing he didn't understand," but her words stayed with him. That night, lying in bed, He stared at the ceiling and whispered them again. Looking ain't the same as seeing, until they lost their shape. Outside, the wind rattled the cane leaves. In the quarters, someone was humming low, a melody meant to keep the dark away. And in the overseer's house, a small boy dreamed of eyes, dozens of them, all open, all watching him back. It was harvest week, the air thick with cane smoke and the bitter scent of molasses. The men in the fields moved like shadows in the heat, their backs glistening, shirts dark with sweat. From the rise near the fence line, Thomas Reed Sr. sat on his horse, barking orders, the whip hanging loose in his hand like a flag of command. Thomas Jr. sat beside him on a smaller horse, legs barely long enough to reach the stirrups. He wore the same hat as his father, though it kept sliding down his forehead. His father would laugh, push it back up and say, "Look at him." My spitting image. The men worked faster when the boy was watching. No one wanted his small voice to say, "Pa, that one's slow," because if he said it, his father would listen. When a mule slipped in the mud, the boy pointed. "See," he said, "that one don't want to work." His father grinned. "Good eye, Tommy. You got that overseer's blood." The man tending the mule glanced up at the child. Just for a second. But it was enough. His face was unreadable, neither hate nor fear, just the dull exhaustion of someone who had seen too much of both. "Fix it, boy," the father barked to the worker. "You got my son watching. Don't make me teach him twice." That evening, back at the house, the overseer invited 2 men from a neighboring plantation for supper. Over whiskey, he bragged, "My boy's got the eye. He spots a slacker before I do. He's 10 and already half a man." The men laughed. "Best start him early," one said. "Break him right before the world breaks him." Ellen Reed didn't join them at the table. She stayed in the kitchen listening through the door as her husband raised a toast. "To order," he said, "and to the sons who'll keep it." When the laughter faded and the men went home, she found her boy out back by the fence, tracing a stick through the dirt. "What are you drawing?" she asked. He didn't look up. "Pa says I'm his eye." She knelt beside him, saw the faint shape of what he was carving. Not a horse, not a man, but a whip. "Is that what you want to be?" she asked softly. He paused. "I want him to be proud." The whip in the dirt coiled like a snake between them. Ellen brushed her fingers across it, smearing the line away. "There's other ways, Tommy." But the boy only frowned, as if trying to understand a language no one had ever taught him. The air in the cane fields that day felt thick enough to choke on. The stalks hissed and whispered in the heat, their blades slicing the skin of any hand that moved too slow. The smell of sweat and sap filled the air, sweet and rotting all at once. Thomas Jr. stood beside his father, the sun burning the back of his neck. He was taller now, but still slight, his shirt too big, his hat shading half his face. The workers bent low among the green rows, moving like tired ghosts. One of them, a man named Elijah, stumbled. It wasn't much, a small pause, a breath too long, but Thomas Sr. saw it. He nudged his son. "You see that?" The boy nodded. He stopped. "That's right." The father's voice was low, calm. "Lazy grows fast. You cut it early, or it spreads." He dismounted and walked to Elijah, the whip uncoiling from his belt with a slow hiss. The sound made the men straighten, made the air itself hold still. "Hot day," the overseer said. "You tired, boy?" Elijah didn't answer. He just kept his eyes on the ground. Thomas Jr. felt his chest tighten, not in fear but in something harder to name. The man looked so human, so breakable, and still his father spoke to him like an animal. The whip cracked once, sharp as lightning. The sound echoed down the rows. Elijah gasped but didn't scream. Then came the second strike, and the third. By the 5th, Thomas Jr. realized something strange. The man wasn't crying out for mercy. He was whispering something over and over under his breath. It took him a moment to hear it. "God! God! God!" The name shuddered out between gritted teeth, soft but steady. Thomas Jr. stared, frozen. He'd heard men curse, beg, promise, but never pray like that. It didn't sound like worship. It sounded like memory. When the beating ended, Elijah collapsed in the dirt, his back a map of open wounds. The overseer turned to his son. "You see what happens when you let weakness fester?" Thomas nodded, but his voice barely came. "Yes, sir." They walked away, the boy's boots leaving small prints beside his father's larger ones. He looked back only once. Elijah was still there, face turned toward the sky, lips moving. That night, Thomas couldn't sleep. He lay awake in the dark, whispering the word he'd heard, God, again and again, tasting it on his tongue. It felt strange there, heavy and secret, like something he wasn't supposed to know. And though he didn't understand why, when he whispered it, he could still hear the sound of his father's whip cutting through the name. The first time Thomas Jr. saw the boy, it was by the wash barrels behind the smokehouse. He couldn't have been more than 10, small, thin, with a scar that cut down the side of his cheek like a line drawn in haste. His name was Moses, and he carried himself the way people do when they've already learned not to be seen. Thomas Jr. had been sent to fetch water. The sun was high, the kind that made sweat sting the eyes. Moses was already there, hauling buckets half his size. When he saw the overseer's son approach, he froze, bowing his head the way everyone did. "You can stand up," Thomas said, not unkindly. Moses hesitated, then lifted his eyes. His voice came out rough. "Yes, sir." The sir stung in a way Thomas couldn't explain. It sounded wrong, too old for the mouth it came from. "You don't gotta call me that," he said. The boy just looked at him. "My pa say it's safer that way." They filled the buckets in silence. Thomas watched how Moses worked. Quick, efficient, no wasted motion. When one bucket slipped and splashed against his leg, Moses flinched hard, like he expected a hand, or worse, to follow. Thomas crouched to help. "You ain't gonna get in trouble." Ain't nobody watching Moses didn't smile. He just whispered, "Somebody always watching." For a while, they met there every few days, sometimes by chance, sometimes not. Thomas would bring scraps from the kitchen, and Moses would trade him stories, not the kind from books, but the ones whispered at night in the quarters, about rivers that swallowed slaves whole to keep them from pain, about women who turned into wind so no man could catch them. Thomas listened to every word. He didn't believe them, not really, but they made him feel something he couldn't find in his father's lessons, a softness he thought he'd buried. One afternoon, while they sat in the shade of the smokehouse, Thomas asked, "Your ma still around?" Moses shook his head. "She gone. Sold when I was little. Where?" The boy shrugged. "Don't matter where. Gone's gone." Thomas didn't know what to say, so he reached into his pocket and handed him a bit of dried fruit. "Here," he said. Moses stared at it, then at him. "Why are you giving me that?" "'Cause I can." The words came out before Thomas could think about them. Moses nodded slowly, chewing in silence. Later, when Thomas went home, his father asked where he'd been. "Just watching," he said. And when his father nodded with approval, the boy didn't tell him what he'd really seen, that not every kind of watching was meant to hurt. The tree stood near the edge of the cane fields, tall, wide, older than the house itself. Its bark was pale and scarred where the bark had split from years of lash and weather. The slaves called it the beating tree, but never when the overseer was near. When they passed it, some averted their eyes, some touched the ground, and some whispered the names of those who had gone quiet beneath its branches. Thomas Jr. had never been that close to it before. His father didn't take him to this part of the land often, but today was lesson day. He rode beside his father as two men dragged a runaway toward the tree. The man's wrists were bound, his shirt torn. The air felt wrong, too still, as though even the wind didn't want to be part of what was coming. From the rows beyond, Thomas spotted Moses standing among the others, his face pale in the sun. Their eyes met, just for a heartbeat, and Moses shook his head once, slow, deliberate. Thomas didn't understand the gesture, or maybe he did, and that made it worse. When they reached the tree, his father dismounted and tied the whip to his belt. He spoke like a preacher beginning a sermon. "Running ain't bravery," he said. It's sickness. And a sickness like that needs cutting out. The men stepped back, forming a wide circle. The boy stayed near the edge, his heart thudding, his mouth dry. The whip cracked once. The sound was louder under the open sky, sharp enough to make the crows scatter from the branches. The man tied to the tree didn't scream right away. He only grunted, body tensing with each strike until his knees buckled. Thomas's father didn't stop. After a while, the boy stopped counting. He told himself not to look away, not to shame the name he carried, but his eyes drifted to Moses again. The other boy was standing still, hands clenched at his sides, tears cutting trails through the dust on his cheeks. Thomas looked away first. That night, he didn't eat. He sat on the porch while his father smoked and bragged to the field boss about how the runaway won't wander no more. When his father finally went inside, Thomas stayed where he was, staring out toward the field. The moon was high, painting the tree silver. From where he sat, it looked almost peaceful, like any other tree. He wondered how something that looked so ordinary could hold so much sound. In the dark, he whispered the name he'd heard the others mutter that day. Beating tree. The words felt like a prayer, or maybe a curse. He wasn't sure which. The mirror in the hallway had belonged to Thomas Reed Sr.'s father. Its surface had gone cloudy with age, the edges ringed with tiny black blooms where silver had peeled away. Ellen hated that mirror, said it never showed things the way they truly were. But the boy liked it. At night, when the house had gone quiet, Thomas Jr. would slip out of bed and stand in front of it, the floorboards cold beneath his bare feet. He'd watch his reflection in the moonlight, trying to copy the way his father stood, shoulders square, chin lifted, jaw clenched. He practiced the voice too, the tone that filled every room. Get back to work. He said it softly at first, just to hear how it sounded, then louder, until the words began to feel heavy in his mouth. Lazy breeds rot, a man fixes rot. He didn't know what the phrases truly meant, only that they carried power. Sometimes he'd reach for the riding crop his father kept near the door, holding it loosely at his side, pretending it was the whip. The shadow it cast on the wall looked taller than him, older, like a second person living inside the boy's body. One night, Ellen woke to the sound of a low voice and the faint thump of the crop against the floorboards. She followed the sound, her nightdress brushing against her ankles, until she saw him, her son, standing before the mirror, his reflection a ghost in the moonlight. He was whispering words she'd heard too many times before. Mercy is weakness. Weakness is rot. He said them the way his father did, same cadence, same rhythm, but slower, like he was tasting each word. She froze in the doorway, afraid to interrupt. When he finally noticed her reflection behind him, he turned his head, startled. "Tommy," she said softly, "what are you doing?" He blinked, as if waking from a dream. "Practicing." "For what?" "To be good," he said simply, "like Pa." She stepped closer. "You don't have to be like him." He frowned. "Then how will I be a man?" The question landed between them like a blow. She wanted to tell him that manhood didn't have to mean cruelty, that strength didn't have to sound like command, but the words caught in her throat. He was only 10, and already her voice no longer reached where his father's had taken root. She reached for his hand, but he stepped back. The boy's reflection stayed still in the mirror, even after he moved, and Ellen realized, with a cold certainty, that something in him had begun to separate, the part that copied, and the part that still remembered how to feel. The summer air had turned thick with thunder that wouldn't fall. The sky stayed heavy and bruised, and the nights were longer than they used to be. That evening, Thomas Reed Sr. pushed open his son's door with the same certainty he used to open the barn doors, as if everything under his roof already belonged to him. "Up," he said quietly. Thomas Jr. blinked awake, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. "Pa?" "Come on, boy. Time you learned something proper." The boy followed him out of the house barefoot, the wood cold beneath his feet. His mother stirred when she heard them leave, but didn't rise. She knew better than to ask. Outside, the lantern swung in his father's hand, its light cutting through the fog that drifted low across the yard. They walked in silence toward the barn. The smell of hay and leather met them like an old hymn. Inside, the whip hung from a nail on the wall. Thomas Senior took it down with a slow, deliberate motion. "Every man's got to learn when to use his hand," he said, voice calm, steady. "World don't care how you feel. It cares what you can make other people do." He turned to his son. "You ever held one?" The boy shook his head. "Then start." He placed the handle in the child's hand. It felt heavier than Thomas expected. The leather was slick from use, and it smelled faintly of smoke. "Don't drop it," the father said, "that there's the weight of a man's word. When you speak, you mean it. When you strike, you finish it." He stood behind him, large hands on the boy's shoulders, guiding his arms. The whip uncoiled and touched the dirt like a serpent. "Now, pull and snap." Firm, not scared. The first swing barely made a sound, a low swish. The father's voice sharpened. "You don't whisper when you talk to sin. Try again." The second one cracked louder, echoing through the barn rafters. The sound startled the boy, but his father smiled. "There. You see? That sound means order." Thomas nodded, though his throat felt dry. He wanted to ask why the world needed that kind of order, why it had to hurt. But his father's pride stopped the question in his mouth. When they walked back to the house, the boy held the whip with both hands, afraid to let it drag. At the door, his father said, "You did good tonight, son. Men'll respect you one day." "Yes, sir," the boy answered softly. Later, lying in bed, Thomas turned the memory over and over. He realized he didn't feel proud or guilty. He just felt still, and that frightened him more than anything. The next morning came with that strange kind of silence that only happens before something important, something everyone feels but no one names. The field was still, the sun hiding behind a haze that made the world look pale. Thomas Reed Sr. rode slow between the rows, the whip coiled neatly at his side. His son followed on foot, clutching the handle of the smaller lash his father had given him the night before. The boy's stomach churned, but not from fear, more from the heavy weight of expectation. "You remember what I taught you," his father said, stopping beside the post. "Firm, final. Don't play with it." In front of them stood a man named Isaiah, hands tied behind his back, sweat sliding down his face. He'd been caught arguing with another worker, nothing more than that. But the overseer called it insubordination. Thomas Jr. looked at his father, waiting for a signal. "Go on, son," the man said quietly. "Show me you got my hand in you." The boy hesitated, his throat dry. The whip trembled in his grip. Isaiah's eyes met his, steady, unafraid. "Don't do it, child," the man said softly. "Ain't no lesson worth your soul." The words struck deeper than the lash ever could. But before the boy could move, his father's hand closed over his, forcing the motion. The whip cracked once, the sound exploding through the air like a gunshot. The man flinched. The boy did too. "Again," his father said, voice low but sharp. Thomas raised the whip again, his arm shaking, but this time he swung on his own. The leather struck, the sound echoing down the row. He didn't feel power, he didn't feel pride, only stillness. His father's hand clapped his shoulder. "That's it. That's how you make men remember." The boy looked at Isaiah, who stared back at him with an expression that wasn't anger or hate. It was sorrow, deep, endless sorrow. Then the man whispered, "Your pa broke your back, boy. Just ain't bent yet." The overseer turned away, laughing. He'll be all right. First time's always hard. But when Thomas Jr. walked home later, the whip still in his hand, he saw his reflection in the house window and didn't recognize the face staring back. That night, he lay in bed and whispered Isaiah's words again and again until they lost meaning. "Your pa broke your back." And in the quiet, he realized that maybe the breaking had already started. The day after the whipping, the house smelled faintly of iron. The scent clung to the boy's hands no matter how much he washed them. He'd scrubbed until his knuckles split and stung, but the smell stayed. Not on his skin, maybe, but somewhere deeper. Somewhere no soap could reach. His mother found him at the basin again that morning, sleeves rolled to the elbows, scrubbing with lye until his small hands turned pink. "Tommy," she said softly, "you'll tear your skin clean off." He didn't answer. He just kept rubbing, the water clouding with suds and red. She stepped closer. "Look at me, son." When he finally did, she almost wished he hadn't. His eyes were flat, not angry, not sad, just emptied of something she used to see there. "What did he make you do?" she whispered. The boy's jaw clenched. "Pa said I did good." Her throat tightened. "That's not what I asked." He blinked, unsure what answer she wanted. "He said I didn't turn away." Her hand flew up and covered her mouth before the cry escaped. She turned from him, shoulders trembling. The boy didn't move to comfort her. He didn't know how anymore. Later, his father came in from the fields, boots heavy with mud. "Boy's learning," he said proudly. "Didn't hesitate after the first one." Ellen's voice shook. "He's a child, Thomas," the overseer smirked, "and he's learning to be a man. The world don't care how small you are when it comes for you." She said nothing after that. The fight had left her. That evening, while his father snored in his chair, Thomas Jr. sat at the window, staring out into the dark. The post was still there, black against the moonlight. He thought about Isaiah's words, about the way the man hadn't cried, about the way he'd looked at him, not like an enemy, but like someone watching a tragedy too big to stop. He whispered to himself, "He said I did good." The words didn't sound right anymore. Outside, the frogs croaked by the river, the steady rhythm filling the space between thoughts. The boy pressed his palm against the window pane, feeling the night's cool breath on his skin. Behind him, his mother watched quietly from the doorway. She didn't call his name. There was nothing left to say that wouldn't make the silence worse. Later that night, a storm rolled through, wind rattling the shutters, rain washing over the dirt and blood in the yard. The sound should have been cleansing, but to the boy it felt like the world trying to erase something it couldn't. When the thunder cracked overhead, he didn't flinch. He'd learned to keep still, like his father. And that was what frightened his mother most. By late August, the mornings had grown sharp with sound. The fields came alive before dawn, insects, frogs, and the far-off rhythm of hoes striking dirt. The world at Blythewood never truly slept, but in the hour before sunrise, everything sounded more alive than human voices had any right to. That was when Thomas Jr. first heard the mockingbird. It perched on the post outside his window, a small grey shape lost in the half-dark. At first he didn't think much of it until it started to sing. The sound stopped him cold. It wasn't the bird call he was used to, no bright trill or easy melody. It was something broken, cracked at the edges. The rhythm of it was too familiar, too human. The bird was copying something it had heard before, a cry. Not loud, not perfect, just a soft, drawn-out note, like the echo of pain turned to habit. He froze, his breath catching. For a long moment he just listened, as the bird repeated it again and again, a faint, trembling wail beneath the morning's calm. When the sun finally rose, the sound stopped. The bird flew off into the cane fields, leaving only the rustle of leaves behind. At breakfast, Thomas stared at his food, untouched. "Something wrong?" his father asked, mouth full. "I heard a bird outside," the boy said quietly. "Sounded strange." His father chuckled. "Mockingbird. They'll repeat anything if they hear it enough. That's nature, boy. They learn what's around them." Ellen looked at her son's face, pale, distant. He whispered, almost to himself, "It was crying." His father laughed. "Then it's heard a lot of crying." The boy's fork slipped from his hand, clattering against the tin plate. The sound made his mother flinch. His father didn't notice. Later that day, Thomas went out to the post. He stood where the bird had been and listened to the quiet hum of flies. When he closed his eyes, he could still hear that strange, aching sound. Not loud, not ghostly, just too close to what he already carried in him. He began to whistle it, softly at first, then louder, trying to match the tone. It felt strange, like letting something out and taking it back in at the same time. When Ellen heard the sound from the porch, she nearly dropped the basket she was carrying. Her boy was standing by the post, eyes closed, whistling a cry that didn't belong to him. She called his name once. He didn't answer. The bird's echo had found another voice. The days after the mockingbird song seemed to stretch longer, as if the air itself was holding its breath. Thomas Jr. spent more time in the fields, not because his father asked him to, but because he wanted to understand what made the men move, what made them stop. He'd watch the workers bending under the sun, the sweat running down their backs in perfect, practiced rhythm. And he began to mimic the rhythm in his speech, short, sharp commands like his father's. Faster. Straighten. Keep time. At first, they didn't take him seriously. He was just a boy, his voice still high, his body small. But when his father's shadow fell across the row behind him, their pace changed. The men started to move quicker, their eyes flicking toward the child, as if the whip itself had spoken. The father laughed. "You see that, Tommy? That's what respect looks like." The boy nodded, but something inside him stirred. Confusion, maybe pride. He didn't know the difference anymore. That afternoon, while his father checked the ledgers, Thomas Jr. stayed behind near the tool shed. 2 boys from the quarters were sorting baskets, both younger than him. He watched them fumble with the weight, dropping one. "You're supposed to stack them straight," he said. They froze. One boy muttered, "Yes, sir." Thomas frowned at the word. He didn't like how it sounded now, the way it scraped the air. "Do it again," he said. They did. The smaller one slipped, the basket tipping over again. Thomas stepped forward, grabbing his wrist, not hard but firm enough to make him wince. "Don't drop it," he said, his tone perfectly even. "You have to learn right." He let go, and the boy rubbed his arm. The overseer's son waited for anger, defiance, anything. But there was only silence. The 2 picked up the baskets and stacked them perfectly. Thomas felt something strange then. Not power, not satisfaction, just stillness. It was the same stillness he'd seen in his father's face when a man obeyed. From across the yard, Aunt Clara watched him. She said nothing until later that evening, when the boy walked past her porch. "You learning too much, child," she said quietly. He paused. "Pa says a man's got to teach." She nodded slowly. "Ain't no sin in teaching. Sin's in what you teach." The boy didn't answer. He only looked away, his jaw tightening the way his father's did when words hit too close to truth. That night, he dreamed of the mockingbird again, but this time it wasn't singing. It was watching him from the window, its black eyes reflecting his own. The first frost came early that year, and with it, the accident. Thomas Reed Sr. had gone riding before dawn, as he always did, to make sure the day started straight. The ground was slick with dew, the kind that hid danger under a silver sheen. When his horse slipped on the slope near the mill road, no one saw it happen, but everyone heard the scream. They carried him back on a door taken off its hinges. The horse was fine, the man was not. His leg had shattered in 2 places, ribs broken, one arm bent wrong. By the time they laid him on the kitchen table, the overseer's face was pale with rage and pain. "Get Doc Harlan," Ellen ordered, but the doctor didn't need to say much when he arrived. The damage was bad, and even if he lived, he'd walk with a limp. "You'll need rest, Thomas," he said quietly. The overseer's jaw clenched. Men don't rest when there's work to do. From the corner, Thomas Jr. watched, silent, wide-eyed, almost afraid to breathe. He'd never seen his father small before. By the next morning, the old man couldn't rise from bed. His voice carried from the upstairs room like thunder muffled behind walls. "Get them moving," he growled. "Daylight's wasting." The workers hesitated, waiting for orders that didn't come. Ellen told them to go slow, to take their time. But Thomas Jr. remembered the look in his father's eyes, that fury that called disobedience sin. So, When the sun rose high, he walked out to the fields. He didn't shout. He didn't raise a whip. He just stood there, small and straight-backed, and said, "Pa says to work faster." And they did. For a week, the plantation moved to the rhythm of the boy's voice. He repeated everything he'd heard his father say, the same tone, the same words, even the same pauses. When the men grew tired, he said, "Fatigue's the devil's gift." When one man stumbled, he said, "Better pain than idleness." They listened not because he was cruel, but because he sounded like the man they feared most. At night, his father would call him to the bedside. "You keep things in line?" "Yes, sir." "That's my boy." The pride in his father's eyes was worse than any punishment. One evening, Ellen found the boy standing outside, staring at the cane fields glowing under the last light. "You don't have to do this, Tommy," she said softly. "He's not God." He didn't turn. "No, ma'am. But he's the one that taught me how to sound like him." She almost spoke, almost told him that imitation was the cruelest kind of worship. But when he turned toward her, she saw his face in the fading sun. The same jaw, the same stillness. And she realized that her husband's fall hadn't stopped anything. It had just changed who carried the whip. The winter light made the fields look almost clean again, but Thomas Jr. knew better. The ground never truly forgot what it had swallowed. Every inch of that red soil held memory, and some mornings he swore he could feel it breathing under his boots. His father's leg had set crooked. He could walk again, but only with a limp and a bitterness that followed him like a second shadow. The old man couldn't ride anymore, couldn't swing the whip with the same power, and the loss ate him alive. "You'll have to do more now," he told his son. "World don't pause 'cause I got broke." So the boy did. He checked the rows, counted the workers, gave the orders. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. The men obeyed his voice the same way they had his father's, maybe even faster. But something in him had started to change. The words he repeated no longer sounded like lessons. They sounded like echoes. Hollow. Distant. One afternoon, while the sun hung low and gold over the cane, Moses stopped working. He stood straight, dust and sweat glinting on his skin. Thomas saw him from across the rows. "You best keep on," he called. Moses didn't move. He looked at the boy calmly. "No." The single word felt like a stone thrown into still water. Everyone froze. Thomas's chest tightened. He was supposed to react. That's what his father would have done, what he expected his son to do. But his hands stayed at his sides. He walked closer. "You know what that means, don't you?" Moses nodded. "Means I'm tired of hurting." The boy swallowed hard. "You don't get to choose that." Moses stepped closer, his eyes level with the boy's. "Then you tell me how much hurt you need before it makes you feel alive." The question stopped him cold. No one had ever spoken to him that way, not even his mother. The silence stretched. The workers kept their eyes on the ground, pretending not to hear. Thomas whispered, "You sound just like him." Moses shook his head. "No, you do." The words hit like a strike. The boy's breath caught, and for the first time he saw himself through someone else's eyes. Not a man, not even a child, just a reflection. He turned and walked away. He didn't punish Moses. He didn't tell his father. That night he sat alone by the window, the world outside pale and quiet. The pain he felt wasn't the kind his father understood. It didn't come from blood or bone. It came from the simple, unbearable knowledge that cruelty could sound like love if you heard it young enough. Winter crept through Blythewood like an illness that refused to die. The fields lay bare, the river sluggish and cold. Inside the house, the fire never went out, and neither did the sound of Thomas Reed Sr.'s voice, roughened by pain but still heavy with authority. "Boy," he would call from his chair, "how many barrels pressed today?" "8, sir." "And how many idle hands?" "None, sir." The answers came quick, practiced. The father's eyes glowed with pride, the way men look at land they've conquered. "See," he'd say to Ellen, who stood by the stove silent. "Told you he's made for it." "My own blood." My echo. She didn't answer any more. Words had long since lost their use in that house. Thomas Jr. spent his days walking the rows, his small boots sinking into the frost-soft dirt. The men no longer looked at him with pity or hate, only resignation. He wasn't cruel, not like his father had been, but he wasn't kind either. He gave orders without anger, corrected without emotion. The calmness made it worse. When a man coughed too hard to work, the boy sent him to the quarters with a bucket of water and a warning. When another stumbled from hunger, he rationed food rather than raise a hand. It was mercy, he thought, order without blood. But every night when he came home, his father asked the same question. "You make them fear you?" And every night Thomas said, "Yes, sir." The lie came easier each time. One evening, after supper, his father beckoned him close. "You've done me proud, boy," he said. "They talk about you down in town." "Say you got the look of command already." Thomas stood straight, his hands behind his back like he'd been taught. "Thank you, Pa." His father smiled, a slow, toothless thing that didn't reach his eyes. "You keep that spine stiff. The world respects a man who don't flinch." Ellen stood at the doorway, her fingers white against the wood. She wanted to scream, to tell her husband that the boy wasn't learning strength, only emptiness, but she stayed still. Later, when the house had gone quiet, she found her son sitting by the window again, watching the moonlight crawl across the floorboards. "Tommy," she whispered, "do you even know what proud feels like?" He looked at her, confusion softening his face for the first time in weeks. "It feels like when Pa says I did right." "And what does right feel like?" He hesitated. "Like nothing." She nodded slowly, tears slipping down her cheeks. "That's not pride, my boy," she said. "That's the sound of your heart going quiet." Ellen Reed had spent years pretending she didn't hear the sounds, the whip's echo through the cane, the boots striking the porch, the silence that followed a scream. But the sound that broke her was quieter. It was her son's voice. The same calm tone, the same measured authority echoing through the yard one morning as he called orders to the men. "2 rows more before sundown," he said. "No anger, no cruelty, just precision," the kind his father prized. She stood at the kitchen window, flour dusting her hands, and watched the child she'd birthed command grown men with a voice that didn't sound like his own. The pride in her husband's face was unbearable. "You see that?" he said, nodding toward the window. "Boy's made for this life. Knows when to speak, when to be silent." She didn't answer. She only pressed her palms into the dough until her hands shook. That night, when the house had gone still, Ellen climbed the stairs and opened her son's door. The moonlight cut through the window, washing the room in silver. Thomas Jr. was awake, sitting on the floor, whittling something small from a block of wood. "What are you making?" she asked softly. He held it up, a small figure, rough but clear. A man bent over, back arched. "It's Pa," he said simply. Her heart stopped. "Why?" He frowned slightly, as if confused by the question. "He says I should remember him how he was. Strong." She sat down beside him, her eyes glistening. "And what about remembering yourself, Tommy?" He shrugged. "Don't reckon that matters much." The words hit her harder than any blow. She took the carving from his hand, staring at the grooves where the whip would have been if he'd had time to finish it. "You don't have to carry him forever," she said, voice trembling. "You can let go." He looked at her for a long time, too long for a child. "Then who am I if I do?" There was no answer she could give that wouldn't sound like a lie. The next morning, Ellen packed a small cloth bag with bread, water, and a folded piece of paper, a map she'd drawn herself, crude but clear enough to guide someone south toward the river. She didn't know yet who it was for. Her husband still slept. Her son was already outside, pacing the rows, a smaller version of the man upstairs. Ellen pressed her hand to the window pane and whispered, "Lord, show me which one I'm meant to save." The choice felt like a knife, and she wasn't sure yet who would bleed when she made it. Ellen Reed moved like a ghost through her own house that night. Every floorboard creaked a memory she didn't want to hear. The moon outside was swollen and pale, and its light cut long across the parlor floor, a thin silver road pointing toward the door. She'd drawn that map for someone to follow south, but she still hadn't decided who it was meant for. Sometimes, when she looked at her husband asleep in his chair, she thought about how easy it would be to end it all. One push into the fire, one scream nobody would stop. But she couldn't. Not with the boy still there. Her son had started to talk in his father's rhythm, the same clipped sentences, the same tired certainty. He didn't even notice it anymore. That was what frightened her most. He wasn't cruel for pleasure. He was cruel by design. So that night, she took the map, the bag of food, and walked down toward the quarters. The air was thick and wet with fog, frogs croaking low by the marsh. A lantern flickered by the smokehouse, Aunt Clara's light. "Evening, Miss Reed," the old woman said, not surprised to see her. Ellen nodded. "I need to ask you something, Clara." Something heavy. The older woman looked at the folded paper in Ellen's hand, then back at her eyes. "Who you drawing roads for?" Ellen hesitated. "The boy." Moses, Clara's face softened, then hardened again. "You sure that's the one who needs saving?" The question hit like a slap. Ellen's voice wavered. "He's still a child. So is yours." They stood in silence a long while, only the sound of insects between them. Ellen's fingers trembled around the map. "I can't save them both," she whispered. Clara sighed. "Then you better choose who gon' carry your sin, 'cause every road takes one soul and leaves another behind." Before dawn, Ellen walked to the edge of the field where the marsh began. She knelt by the mud and buried the map under a flat stone, just deep enough to hide, not deep enough to lose. If Moses found it, maybe it meant God had chosen him. If he didn't, maybe her own son still had a chance to come back. She whispered into the wind, "Whoever finds it first, Lord, let it be the one still worth saving." When she turned back toward the house, the first light of morning was cutting through the fog, painting the cane stalks gold. And from the porch, she saw her boy already awake, standing straight, watching her from a distance, too still, too calm. For a moment she thought he might have seen her bury it, but his face gave nothing away. That night, the air smelled like rain again, the kind that came heavy and sudden, with thunder that rolled slow and deep like the world's own grief. The fields shimmered under flashes of lightning, the cane trembling in waves. Moses had been watching the weather all day. He said storms made the dogs restless, made the men sleep lighter, but their torches burn out faster. He didn't tell anyone what he was planning, but Aunt Clara knew. She always knew. She handed him a bundle before the rain came, half a loaf of bread, a piece of dried meat, and a folded paper still damp around the edges. "Found this by the marsh," she whispered. Moses looked down, recognizing the careful lines, the handwriting too neat to belong to anyone from the quarters. "Miss Reed?" he asked. Clara only nodded. "Don't thank her. She done damned herself enough already." He tucked the map into his shirt, heart pounding so loud it drowned the thunder. "Go before it breaks," she said. "Follow the river till it splits. Don't look back, child." But he did look back. Once. From the porch, the boy was watching. Thomas Jr. stood in the dark, the rain plastering his hair to his forehead, eyes reflecting lightning like a pair of mirrors. He'd seen Moses slip through the yard, seen the bundle, the quick steps. He should have called out. His father would have heard. Instead, he stayed still. Something twisted inside him. Not loyalty, not mercy, just confusion. He wanted to understand why Moses was running. What was out there that made risking death worth it? The storm cracked open, rain hitting like stones. Moses broke into a run, his bare feet slapping through the mud, vanishing between the stalks of cane. The boy's heart raced. He whispered, "Go," before he even knew why. When his father came down the stairs, shouting about the dogs barking in the distance, Thomas stood by the door, soaked, small, still trembling. "What happened?" his father demanded. "Someone's out," the boy said. "Toward the river." "You see who?" Thomas paused. "No, sir." His father grabbed his rifle. "Then we'll find out." They rode into the rain together, one man, one boy, lantern light slicing through the dark. The dogs bayed in the distance, their howls echoing through the cane. Every sound of the chase made Thomas's stomach turn, every flash of lightning painting the world in ghost white. He wanted to look away, but didn't. He couldn't. He was his father's son. But when the dogs stopped barking, when only the river's roar remained, Thomas prayed, not for capture, not for justice, but for Moses to be gone, far gone. He didn't say it out loud. He didn't need to, because when the thunder rolled again, the mockingbird screamed, loud, wild, and human, and the boy's heart broke in silence. By morning, the storm had softened into mist, the kind that clings to the skin and hides the world in pale grey. The search party returned at dawn, horses wet, boots heavy, tempers low. The dogs were quiet now, their coats streaked with mud, their eyes dull. No one spoke at first. They didn't have to. The silence already told the story. Thomas Jr. rode behind his father, the boy's small hands gripping the saddle horn. The river glimmered ahead, swollen and restless from the rain. It moved slow, wide, and full of debris, broken branches, bits of fence, the remains of things carried too far. They found a shoe tangled in reeds first, then a strip of cloth. The old man dismounted, leaning on his cane, eyes sharp as ever. "Search the bend," he barked. The men waded into the shallows. The water reached their knees, their waists. Then one of them called out, not loud, but enough to stop the world. A shape drifted near the bank, face down, caught in a curl of branches. When they turned it over, the body was small, too small, but it wasn't the boy. It was the old woman, Aunt Clara. Her arms were wrapped around something, a bundle still clutched tight against her chest. When they pried it loose, they found the folded paper inside, soaked and nearly gone. The map. Thomas Sr. cursed, spitting into the mud. She helped him. Damn witch. He kicked the wet dirt, fury twisting his face, but the pain in his leg stopped him short. Thomas Jr. stared at the body. Her eyes were open, cloudy, turned toward the sky. She didn't look afraid. She looked done. He knelt beside her before anyone could stop him. There was something else in her hand, a small bit of twine, wound tight, broken at one end. The boy whispered, "She tied him to her." The father heard. "What?" "She didn't let him go. She made sure the river took her first." For once, his father didn't speak. The words hung between them like fog. That night, the boy sat by the same river, alone. The water had calmed, its surface flat and silver under the moon. He held the piece of twine in his hand and whispered the names he knew, Moses, Clara, until they blurred into one sound. He wondered if the river remembered what it took, if it ever let go of what it kept. Behind him, in the house, his father drank and raged. His mother wept quietly upstairs. But Thomas didn't hear any of it. The mockingbird was back, perched on the fence, its cry soft and broken. This time, when it sang, the boy didn't flinch. He only listened. And for the first time in his short, haunted life, he felt something close to mercy. The weeks that followed blurred together. The overseer limped through the fields, shouting less now, though the fury in him never dulled. The workers moved with that old rhythm again, quiet, careful, eyes lowered. The world had returned to its shape. But for Thomas Jr., nothing fit right anymore. He no longer carried the whip. He didn't need to. His father never noticed. The man's pride was fixed on the fact that the fields ran smooth again, that discipline had settled. "Boy's turned into a man," he said to anyone who'd listen. "Knows how to keep order." But Thomas didn't believe in order anymore. He didn't believe in much of anything. At night, he'd sit on the back steps, staring at the tree line where the cane met the river. Sometimes he thought he saw movement there, not shadows, not ghosts, just something watching. The kind of stillness that comes before a question you're too afraid to ask. One evening, his father called for him. The old man sat in his chair, legs stretched out stiff, a half-empty bottle on the table. The fire threw long shapes across the wall. "Tommy," he said, voice slow, heavy with drink, "you've done good. You keep this place in line. You made me proud." The boy stood silent. "You hear me?" "Yes, sir." The father chuckled, but it came out like a cough. "Only thing left now, you gotta learn to be feared without lifting your hand. Words'll do it. That's the trick. Fear ain't in what you do. It's in what they think you will do." He leaned forward, eyes red and glassy. "That's the last lesson, boy. Don't forget it." Thomas stared at the man who had built his world, the one who taught him how to speak, how to look, how to bury mercy under discipline. The firelight flickered, turning his father's face into something hard and hollow. He whispered, "Yes, sir." But in his head, he said something else. No more. When dawn came, Ellen found her husband asleep in his chair, the bottle on its side. The fire burned to ash. Her son was gone. Out by the river, the mist hung low over the water. Thomas stood at its edge, holding the piece of twine Clara had left behind. The mockingbird sat on a nearby post, silent now. He looked at his reflection, the same cold eyes, the same set jaw. For the first time, he didn't see his father there. He saw something fragile instead, something that might still bend before it broke. He tied the twine around his wrist, tight enough to sting, and whispered, "I'll remember, but I won't become." The words drifted into the fog. The river carried them away. When he turned back toward the house, the sun was rising, pale and thin, like forgiveness trying to find its shape. And the mockingbird began to sing again. They said the cane fields at Blythewood grew thicker the year after the storm, that the earth, once red, turned dark as if it had swallowed something it meant to keep. Thomas Reed Jr. would grow into a quiet man. He never took his father's chair, never raised his hand to another soul. But he never spoke of the river, or the bird that sang when no one else would. Some said he left, heading north with the war that came years later. Others swore they saw him still, walking those same fields at dusk, hands empty, eyes fixed on nothing. But the truth is simpler. A boy raised to believe that cruelty was order and silence was strength, learned too late that both sound the same when they echo long enough. History doesn't remember his name. It remembers the whip, the tree, the silence. It remembers what fathers passed down and what sons must bury to survive it. If stories like this speak to you, stories of memory, guilt, and the ghosts that live inside history, subscribe to the Macabre Record. Every day we uncover the tales time tried to forget, the human horror that doesn't need monsters because the real ones already lived among us. Subscribe now and listen closely, because some stories never die, they just wait to be told again.